She wasn't even your real grandmother, my father, Alistair hissed, his distinguished features contorted into an ugly mask of fury. Only true Ashworth blood is entitled to the family holdings. I stood, numb, in the grand library of Ashworth Manor, the ancestral estate in the rolling hills of the Cotswolds. Floor-to-ceiling mahogany shelves, crammed with antique, leather-bound volumes, seemed to lean in, silent, judgmental witnesses to his venom. Grandmother Annalise had been laid to rest just 3 days prior, and already, the vultures were circling, the family splintering over the contents of her will. "What are you saying?" I managed, my voice a mere whisper against the frantic thumping of my own heart. "Don't feign ignorance, Cordelia." He paced the worn Persian carpet, his steps agitated. He paused, glaring up at the imposing oil portrait of Grandmother Annalise that dominated the space above the stone fireplace. Annalise was obsessed with lineage. "Once the solicitors confirm you haven't a drop of Ashworth blood, you'll receive precisely nothing." I met his cold, gray eyes, fighting to keep my voice even. "Do you swear by that?" "That only blood relatives deserve grandmother's inheritance." "Absolutely," he declared, his chin tilting with that familiar, imperious air I'd endured throughout my 27 years. "I'll ensure the Ashworth legacy remains with actual Ashworths, not some interloper. My name is Cordelia Thorne. Or, until 5 minutes ago, I believed it was Cordelia Ashworth. Now, standing in this centuries-old manor, I was apparently learning otherwise. My desire was simple, the equitable consideration Grandmother Annalise had assured me of in her will. She had specifically mentioned me, her only granddaughter, during our last poignant discussion about her estate. Blocking my path was the man who had always regarded me with a thinly veiled disdain. The man whose approval I had spent a lifetime fruitlessly seeking. "You may attend the will reading next week, if you insist," he continued, his tone dismissive. "But don't expect a windfall. I've already conferred with Mr. Davies about contesting any clauses that benefit you." Reginald Davies was Alistair's old school chum and the long-standing family solicitor. The implication of their collusion sent an icy shiver down my spine. "I'll be there," I replied, my voice quiet but firm. "Grandmother would have wanted me there." "Sentiment," he scoffed. "Annalise always had a weakness for you." "Fortunately, the law prioritizes facts, not feelings." As he swept from the room, I sank into Grandmother's colossal, leather-bound desk chair, my fingers tracing the cool, polished oak where she had penned countless letters, scrutinized business ledgers for the Ashworth textile empire, and, most recently, finalized her last will and testament. My mobile vibrated. "A text from my mother. Evelyn, we need to discuss your father. Tonight. Just us." I stared at the screen, a profound unease coiling within me. If Alistair wasn't my biological father, then who was? And how had this monumental secret remained buried for nearly 3 decades? More critically, why was it surfacing now, mere days after Annalise's passing and just before her considerable fortune was to be apportioned? Whatever truth awaited, one thing was painfully clear. The man I'd strived my entire life to please harbored a resentment far deeper and more poisonous than I had ever fathomed. Growing up in Ashworth meant navigating a world of immense privilege and crushing expectations. The Ashworth fortune, initially built on innovative wool processing in the 19th century and astutely diversified into global equities, had supported 3 generations in considerable style. My father, Alistair, was the elder of Annalise's 2 sons, automatically positioning him as the heir apparent to the lion's share of the Ashworth assets. His younger brother, Uncle Frederick, had always been the family maverick, brilliant, charming, but restless, unwilling to be shoehorned into Grandfather Arthur's rigid template for the family dynasty. He'd left England to pioneer sustainable agriculture projects in New Zealand, returning only sporadically for significant family occasions. My memories of Uncle Frederick were scarce, but cherished. His easy laughter, his insightful questions, the way he'd listened to my childish pronouncements as if they held genuine wisdom. In stark contrast, my relationship with Alistair had always been fraught with tension. He was a man who equated worth with tangible achievements and societal standing. My elder brothers, George and Henry, had met his expectations flawlessly, George following him into the directorship of Ashworth Holdings, Henry excelling as a barrister in London. I, however, had been a consistent disappointment. "She lacks the Ashworth fortitude," he'd once remarked to my mother, believing me out of earshot. Too sensitive, too artistic. Despite graduating with first-class honors in art history and carving out a promising niche as a museum curator in Bristol, nothing I achieved ever seemed to satisfy his exacting standards. I'd always chalked it up to old-fashioned sexism, or perhaps simply his unyielding nature, never dreaming there might be a more fundamental, biological reason for his detachment. Grandmother Annalise had been my refuge. Unlike Alistair, she cherished my passion for history and aesthetics, encouraging me to forge a path that resonated with my soul rather than adhering to family convention. During my university years, I'd drive to Ashworth Manor every other Sunday for tea, captivated by her tales of family lore and her own quiet acts of defiance against the societal strictures imposed upon women of her generation. "Remember, Cordelia," she'd often counsel, her eyes twinkling, "a true Ashworth charts their own course." Her peaceful passing at 89 had left a void I was still struggling to comprehend. The realization that I'd lost my staunchest ally within the family made her absence all the more acute. In the days following her funeral, I'd registered subtle shifts in Alistair's demeanor, intensified scrutiny when I engaged with other relatives, hushed conferences with Reginald Davies that ceased abruptly upon my approach. I'd initially dismissed these as grief manifesting in peculiar ways. Now, they acquired a more ominous hue. The last time I'd seen Grandmother Annalise alive, she'd clasped my hand, her grip surprisingly firm, and whispered, "Trust your intuition, Cordelia. Not everything is as it seems." At the time, I'd attributed her cryptic words to her medication or end-of-life weariness. Now, I wondered if she'd been attempting to brace me for the tempest about to engulf our family. Leaving the library to meet my mother, I couldn't shake the premonition that I was being ensnared in a family drama that had been brewing for decades, its roots far deeper than I could yet fathom. My mother was waiting at the Willow Tea Room, a quaint establishment in a quiet side street of the nearby market town, a place where the Ashworth name carried little weight. She looked diminished, her usually immaculate grooming slightly askew, her eyes shadowed with fatigue. "I never intended for you to discover it this way," she began, her voice strained, her fingers twisting her platinum wedding band. "Alistair, he shouldn't have told you like that." It was malicious and entirely self-serving. "So, it's true?" I asked, my voice barely audible. "He's not my biological father?" She nodded, tears welling in her expressive blue eyes. "It's complicated, Cordelia. Far more complicated than Alistair would have you believe." Over the next hour, my mother unraveled a narrative that shattered the foundations of my entire existence. She and Frederick, my uncle, had been deeply in love before she ever met Alistair. They were young, idealistic, planning a life together when Frederick received a prestigious fellowship to conduct research in New Zealand. "We agreed he should accept," she explained, her voice trembling. "It was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. We believed we could endure the distance." But the separation had eroded their bond. During a particularly bleak period, she'd found solace in Alistair's company. He had always admired her from afar. A moment of profound vulnerability led to a brief liaison, one she swiftly ended upon realizing her heart still belonged to Frederick. When I discovered I was pregnant, I was utterly convinced it was Frederick's child. The timing aligned perfectly with his last visit home. Her voice cracked, but Alistair vehemently insisted the child was his. Frederick, by then, was engaged to another woman in Auckland. I couldn't bear to disrupt his new life. Alistair proposed immediately, framing their marriage as the honorable course of action. Only later did my mother discern that Alistair's interest had never been solely about her. The Ashworth family trust had stringent primogeniture clauses, favoring male heirs with legitimate issue, she said, a bitter edge to her tone. He needed a wife and children to solidify his claim. And I needed security for my baby. It seemed the most pragmatic solution at the time. Years slipped by. The secret held fast. Frederick eventually returned to England with his wife, though they remained childless. When his marriage dissolved, he immersed himself in his agricultural work, becoming increasingly estranged from the family's core affairs. Did Frederick ever know? I asked, the question hanging heavy in the air. No, my mother whispered. I couldn't bring myself to shatter his world again. And as time passed, it felt crueler still to unearth the truth. The revelation sent me reeling. Every childhood memory now demanded reevaluation. Alistair's consistent coldness, Uncle Frederick's surprising warmth during his infrequent visits, grandmother Annalise's particular, unwavering affection for me. Why is Alistair revealing this now? I finally managed. My mother's expression hardened. Your grandmother's will. He's always been obsessed with the Ashworth fortune. Now he's terrified Annalise might have left you a substantial portion. He needs to invalidate your claim. But if I'm not an Ashworth by Alistair's bloodline. That's precisely it, she interrupted, a flicker of something unreadable in her eyes. You are an Ashworth by blood. Just not Alistair's child. You are Frederick's daughter, Cordelia. Which makes you Annalise's granddaughter by direct bloodline, regardless. The irony was almost breathtaking. Alistair's desperate gambit to exclude me from the inheritance by refuting our biological tie might, in fact, fortify my claim through an entirely different branch of the family tree. What do I do now? I asked, feeling utterly adrift in this newly unveiled reality. My mother reached across the small table, her hand clasping mine. That, my dear, depends on what you want. Justice? Acknowledgement? Or simply your rightful share of what Annalise intended for you? I had no immediate answer. The betrayal was too raw, the implications too vast to assimilate in a single conversation. But as we left the tea room, one certainty began to crystallize. I would not permit Alistair Ashworth to obliterate my history for his pecuniary gain. The pressing question was how to substantiate my true parentage before the will reading, and whether that truth would ultimately aid or hinder my standing within the labyrinthine rules of the Ashworth inheritance. The following morning, I drove to Uncle Frederick's farm, a sprawling, somewhat ramshackle property a county over, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. I had telephoned ahead, keeping my purpose deliberately vague, family matters to discuss before the reading. Now, seated in his cozy, book-strewn living room, surrounded by agricultural journals and photographs from his time in New Zealand, I struggled to find the words to detonate his world alongside mine. You seem troubled, Cordelia, he observed, placing 2 mugs of steaming tea on the rustic coffee table. At 60, Frederick Ashworth retained a rugged handsomeness, with the same deep-set hazel eyes I saw in my own reflection each morning. Is Alistair making things difficult about Annalise's estate? It's more complicated than that, I began, then faltered. How did one broach such a subject? Uncle Frederick, did you and were you ever involved before she married father? The mug froze halfway to his lips, his expression shifting from mild surprise to guarded caution. Why would you dredge up ancient history now, Cordelia? Because Alistair has informed me that he is not my biological father. And he's leveraging that assertion to challenge my inclusion in grandmother's will. Frederick set his mug down with deliberate slowness. That sounds like Alistair. Calculating, even in his cruelty. He studied my face with a newfound intensity. What has your mother told you? I recounted Evelyn's revelations about their past, watching his expressions morph through nostalgia, regret, and something that looked astonishingly like dawning hope. I never knew, he said finally, his voice low. Evelyn never told me she was pregnant. By the time I heard about the marriage, it was a fait accompli. He leaned forward, his gaze earnest. Cordelia, are you suggesting you believe I might be your father? The timing aligns, according to Mother. But Alistair is determined to prove I have no Ashworth blood to claim my inheritance. Frederick's expression darkened. Annalise's will specifically names you. Alistair can't simply erase you from it. He claims he can challenge any provisions made under false pretenses, namely, that grandmother believed me to be his biological daughter. Frederick rose abruptly, pacing the confines of the small room. This is preposterous. Even if you weren't Alistair's biological child, you're still Annalise's granddaughter. If you are my daughter. He stopped, meeting my gaze directly. We need to be certain. A DNA test would settle this definitively. The clinical simplicity of his solution was both a relief and a terror. You'd be willing to take one? Without a moment's hesitation, he replied. I've always felt a connection to you, Cordelia, one I couldn't quite articulate. If you are my daughter. His voice caught. Well, let's ascertain the facts before we get carried away. We arranged for expedited testing that very day, using a private Harley Street laboratory that promised results within 72 hours, just in time for the will reading. As we submitted our samples, a peculiar amalgam of dread and anticipation churned in my stomach. Regardless of the outcome, my relationships with both men would be irrevocably altered. While awaiting the results, I attempted to glean information about grandmother's will. I contacted her personal solicitor, Theodore Crane, a man separate from the family's usual counsel, Reginald Davies. I'm afraid I cannot discuss the specific provisions before the official reading, Ms. Thorne, Mr. Crane explained when I visited his sober Lincoln's Inn Fields office. But I can assure you, your grandmother was of exceptionally sound mind and very precise about her intentions. Did she know? I asked, the question blunt. About my biological parentage? Mr. Crane's meticulously neutral expression flickered almost imperceptibly. I cannot comment on that. But I will say that Annalise Ashworth was a remarkably astute woman. Very little escaped her notice. His non-answer spoke volumes. Grandmother had suspected, perhaps even confirmed, that I was Frederick's daughter, not Alistair's. My momentary sense of triumph vanished when I received a formal letter that evening. Reginald Davies, on Alistair's behalf, had petitioned the court to postpone the will reading, citing pending resolution of identity concerns regarding purported beneficiaries. Alistair was moving faster than I'd anticipated, using his legal clout to buy time while he fortified his case against me. When I telephoned Theodore Crane to inquire about the delay, his clerk informed me he had been suddenly hospitalized with severe bronchitis and would be unavailable indefinitely. It couldn't be a coincidence. Alistair was systematically neutralizing my potential allies and access to information. Without Crane or the DNA results, I would enter the will reading at a crippling disadvantage. That night, my mother called, her voice laced with panic. Alistair knows you met with Frederick. He's incandescent, Cordelia. Be careful. When Alistair feels cornered, he becomes dangerous. The DNA results arrived via encrypted email 2 days before the rescheduled will reading. With trembling fingers, I opened the document, scanning for the conclusion buried amidst the scientific jargon. Probability of paternity, 99.99998%. Frederick Ashworth was, unequivocally, my biological father. I sat back, a torrent of emotions flooding through me, vindication, grief for the relationship I'd never had, white-hot anger at the years of deception. The scientific confirmation transformed abstract possibility into unassailable reality. Alistair, the man who had coldly dismissed me my entire life, was not my father at all. I immediately called Frederick, who received the news with quiet, profound emotion. I suspected, from the moment you asked, he admitted. You have Evelyn's smile, but those eyes, they're Ashworth eyes. My mother's eyes. We agreed to meet before the will reading to strategize. Armed with DNA proof, I finally possessed leverage against Alastair. Or so I believed. That evening, Reginald Davies requested an urgent meeting at his offices in Mayfair. Despite my deep misgivings, I agreed, curious about this sudden overture from Alastair's legal enforcer. The opulent offices of Davies and Crichton exuded old money and unshakable discretion. Davies, silver-haired and impeccably attired in a Seville row suit, greeted me with a practiced cordiality that didn't quite reach his shrewd eyes. "Cordelia, thank you for coming. I thought it prudent we discuss certain developments before the reading." "You mean the fact that Alastair isn't my biological father? Or that you filed a spurious petition to delay proceedings?" His smile tightened. "Actually, I was referring to the DNA test you and Frederick arranged." My blood ran cold. How could he possibly know? We had been meticulously discreet. Alastair was quite distressed to learn of this independent investigation. Davies continued, his tone smooth as silk. "He asked me to convey a proposal." He slid a document across the polished mahogany desk. It was a waiver agreement. Relinquish all claims to Annalise Ashworth's estate in exchange for a one-time settlement of £500,000. "This is absurd," I said, pushing it back. "Grandmother specifically included me in her will." "Yes, under the presumption you were Alastair's daughter. Now that we know otherwise." "Now we know I'm Frederick's daughter," I interrupted, "which makes me even more legitimately Annalise's granddaughter than if I were Alastair's. Only blood relatives deserve the family fortune. Isn't that Alastair's mantra?" Davies's expression shifted, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. "There are complexities you're unaware of, Cordelia. Legal nuances regarding the Ashworth Trust that supersedes simple biology." "What complexities?" "I'm not at liberty to discuss details before the reading, but I strongly advise you to consider this offer. Alastair is prepared to be quite vigorous in defending the family interests." The veiled threat hung palpably between us. I left without signing, more resolute than ever to stand my ground, but deeply unsettled by Davies's unwavering confidence, despite our seemingly irrefutable DNA evidence. The next morning brought the revelation that shattered my understanding of the entire Machiavellian charade. Frederick called, his voice taut with controlled fury. "Cordelia, I've just received some profoundly disturbing information from an old family confidant, Mrs. Periwinkle, who was housekeeper at Ashworth Manor for my father for decades." He paused, the silence crackling. "Alastair. Alastair is not biologically an Ashworth." The room seemed to tilt. "What?" "Apparently, my parents adopted Alastair as an infant after mother suffered several devastating miscarriages. When she unexpectedly conceived me years later, they decided to keep the adoption a closely guarded secret, not wanting Alastair to ever feel less than their son." The implication struck me with the force of a physical blow. If Alastair wasn't an Ashworth by blood, then by his own damning logic. "Does Alastair know?" I managed, my voice a hoarse whisper. "I don't believe so. Our parents took the secret to their graves." But Annalise might have known. She and my mother were exceptionally close. "That's why Davies was so confident," I breathed. "There must be something in the will, or the trust document, specifying direct blood relations." "Precisely. I've been poring over copies of the original Ashworth Trust. There's a specific clause, Clause 7b, requiring direct, unbroken bloodline descent for principal inheritance. Alastair would have been protected by his legal adoption, of course. But by making this entire dispute about biological legitimacy, he's potentially disqualified himself." The irony was almost too perfect. Alastair's vicious attempt to disinherit me by questioning my biological connection to the Ashworth line could backfire catastrophically if his own adoption came to light. "What do we do with this information?" I asked. Frederick was quiet for a moment. "That, Cordelia, depends on what you want. What Alastair deserves and what is ultimately right for our family might be two very different things." I considered his words carefully. I think I said slowly that people who insist on blood purity should be held to their own exacting standards. Don't you? The morning of the will reading dawned crisp and clear, the Cotswold autumn painting the ancient trees surrounding Ashworth Manor in hues of gold and crimson. I arrived early with Frederick, our shared, explosive secret, a fragile weapon we weren't yet certain how to deploy. Reginald Davies presided from the head of the long, imposing dining table, a leather-bound portfolio open before him. Various Ashworth cousins and distant relations filled the high-backed Jacobean chairs. Alastair sat directly opposite me, his posture radiating an almost unbearable smugness, flanked by my brothers, George and Henry, who looked distinctly uncomfortable but resolutely supportive of their father. "Before we commence," Davies announced, his voice sonorous, "I must address a rather delicate matter concerning succession eligibility." Alastair straightened, shooting me a look of pure triumph. "It has come to our attention that certain beneficiaries named in Annalise Ashworth's will may not, in fact, qualify under the bloodline provisions of the original Ashworth family trust." My mother, seated beside me, gripped my hand beneath the table. Davies continued, "As you are aware, Annalise's estate is divided between assets she controlled independently and those governed by the family trust, established by her father, Arthur Ashworth. The trust specifically mandates that beneficiaries be direct blood descendants of the Ashworth line, which is precisely why we need to address Cordelia's situation," Alastair interrupted smoothly, his voice resonating with false gravitas. "Recent, irrefutable information suggests she is not my biological daughter and, therefore, possesses no legitimate claim to the Ashworth inheritance." A ripple of shocked murmurs circulated the room. Frederick and I exchanged a loaded glance. Our meticulously rehearsed plan was suddenly, catastrophically, derailed by Alastair's preemptive strike. "I have DNA evidence," Alastair continued, sliding a sleek folder across the polished table towards Davies, confirming Cordelia is not my biological child. "Under the bloodline requirement, she is ineligible for any distribution from the trust." My heart pounded as Davies perused the documents. We had anticipated raising the paternity issue ourselves, but Alastair had outmaneuvered us, presenting his own testing I had never consented to, nor provided samples for. "May I inquire how you obtained my DNA for this test?" I asked, fighting to keep my voice level. Alastair's smile was glacial. "From a water glass you used at our last family luncheon." "Quite straightforward, really." "That's illegal," Frederick interjected, his voice sharp. "Unauthorized DNA procurement. Irrelevant to the question of inheritance," Davies cut in, his tone dismissive. "The science is sound, regardless of the collection method." I felt our carefully constructed strategy crumbling. If Davies accepted Alastair's evidence while brushing aside the illegality of its acquisition, we would lose our chance to reveal the truth on our own terms. "I have additional evidence pertinent to the bloodline question," I said firmly, retrieving our own certified test results from my briefcase. "DNA confirmation that Frederick Ashworth is my biological father." The room erupted in a cacophony of shocked exclamations. Alastair's face contorted with apoplectic fury as he whirled on my mother, who met his venomous glare with quiet dignity. "This changes nothing," Davies insisted after scrutinizing our documentation, though a flicker of unease crossed his features. "The trust specifies Ashworth blood from Annalise's direct patrilineal line, which flows through her son, Alastair, to his legitimate heirs. It was the opening we needed." Frederick stood slowly, his presence commanding the room's sudden, rapt attention. "I believe we need to examine the precise language of the trust," he said, his voice calm but carrying undeniable authority. "My understanding, Mr. Davies, is that it requires beneficiaries to be blood descendants of Arthur Ashworth, Annalise's father. If that is indeed the case, then we have a rather significant problem." Davies frowned. "What problem?" "Alastair," Frederick stated, his voice clear and unwavering, "is not biologically an Ashworth. He was adopted as an infant, a fact our parents kept private to protect him, but of which Annalise was fully aware. The silence that descended upon the room was absolute, deafening. Alistair's face drained of all color as he stared at his brother, his shock naked and visceral. That's absurd, he finally sputtered. A desperate, contemptible lie. I have the adoption records, Frederick continued, implacable. And DNA confirmation. He produced another folder. If we are applying a strict bloodline test, as Alistair so vehemently insists, then I am Annalise's only biological child. And Cordelia, as my biological daughter, is her only direct blood grandchild. Davies looked utterly stricken as he examined the new documents, his ingrained loyalty to Alistair visibly warring with his professional obligations. This is outrageous, Alistair shouted, lurching to his feet. I won't stand for this slander. You're the one who insisted only blood relatives deserve the Ashworth fortune, I reminded him quietly. Are you retracting that position now? Before Alistair could respond, the heavy oak library doors opened to reveal a frail but remarkably determined Theodore Crane, grandmother's personal solicitor, leaning heavily on an antique silver-topped cane. My apologies for my tardiness, he said, his sharp gaze sweeping the room, taking in the palpable tension. He nodded curtly to me. I believe my presence is required for this reading. Davies's visible dismay confirmed our suspicion. Crane's unexpected recovery had scuttled whatever legal machinations Alistair had orchestrated in his absence. I should like to review these documents before we proceed, Crane insisted, his experienced eyes already noting the array of test results and adoption papers spread across the table. As Crane settled himself, adjusting his spectacles, Alistair looked genuinely afraid for the first time. Whatever elaborate scheme he had concocted with Davies was rapidly unraveling, but his desperation made him unpredictable, potentially even more dangerous. Mr. Crane meticulously reviewed the final pages of Grandmother Annalise's will, his voice, when he finally spoke, steady and authoritative. Before addressing specific bequests, I must draw your attention to a letter Annalise Ashworth instructed me to read should any questions of lineage arise during this proceeding. He opened a sealed, cream-colored envelope, the Ashworth family crest embossed upon it. The room fell utterly silent as he began to read. To my family, gathered here, if this letter is being read, then the secret I have guarded for decades has finally come to light. I have always known that Alistair, my dear boy, was not born of Ashworth blood, but was welcomed into our hearts and family through adoption, a noble act of love by my husband and myself after years of heartbreaking loss. I have also known, since the moment I first held her in my arms, that Cordelia is Frederick's biological daughter. A grandmother knows her own blood. The Ashworth Family Trust, established by my father, is a product of its time and requires direct blood relation for principal inheritance. Having anticipated potential conflict, I have restructured my personal assets, which constitute the vast majority of what you now call the Ashworth fortune, to reflect my own wishes, rather than outdated, exclusionary notions of bloodline purity. To Alistair, you have been my son in every way that has ever mattered. However, your treatment of Cordelia, your own brother's child, has revealed a facet of your character that profoundly dishonors the Ashworth name you so jealously guard. By your own strident insistence on blood qualification, you have, ironically, disqualified yourself from that which you most covet. Crane paused, looking directly at Alistair, whose face had become a ghastly shade of gray. In accordance with Annalise's explicit instructions, Crane continued, his voice firm, and in light of the DNA evidence presented today confirming both Alistair's adoption and Cordelia's parentage by Frederick Ashworth, the distribution is as follows. The trust assets, requiring Ashworth bloodline, pass to Frederick Ashworth and his biological daughter, Cordelia Thorne. Annalise's extensive personal estate will be distributed according to the specific bequests outlined herein. Alistair lunged for the documents, a strangled cry escaping him, but Crane calmly shifted them beyond his reach. "You promised." Alistair shrieked at me, his composure utterly shattered, desperation breaking through. "You said only blood relatives deserve the fortune." "No," I corrected him, my voice quiet but carrying in the stunned silence. "You said that. I merely asked if you would keep your word about it, and you promised you would." The justice of that moment wasn't in the inheritance itself, but in watching Alistair's meticulously constructed, exclusionary reality crumble under the immense weight of his own hypocrisy. The aftermath of the will reading unfolded like the denouement of a particularly satisfying Jacobean drama. Alistair, undone by his own machinations, stormed from Ashworth Manor, shouting empty threats of legal challenges that everyone present knew were futile. Reginald Davies followed, his professional reputation in tatters after Crane subtly revealed his prior knowledge of the adoption records Davies had deliberately attempted to suppress. My brothers, George and Henry, stunned by the cascading revelations, approached me with an air of profound uncertainty. George, always the more reflective of the two, spoke first. I had no idea, Cordelia, about any of this," he said, his voice subdued. "All those years, the way he treated you, it makes a terrible kind of sense now." Henry nodded, his expression somber. "For what it's worth, you've always been our sister. That hasn't changed." Their sincerity, hesitant yet genuine, moved me more than I expected. They, too, had been shaped by Alistair's rigid worldview, albeit differently. Perhaps, with time, there was a relationship worth salvaging there. Mother approached next, a complex amalgam of relief and apprehension etched on her face. "I should have told you years ago," she whispered. I couldn't. You were protecting me. I finished for her, a new understanding dawning. And perhaps yourself. I understand that now." The most profound conversation, however, came later that evening, as Frederick and I sat in Grandmother Annalise's library, surrounded by the silent testimonials of a family history we were both, in our own ways, beginning to rewrite. "What will you do now?" he asked, the unspoken weight of missed decades hanging between us. "Build something new," I answered simply. "We can't reclaim the time we've lost, Frederick, but perhaps we can create something better, something honest, going forward." He smiled, the expression so strikingly similar to my own that I marveled at how I hadn't recognized the profound resemblance before. "I'd like that very much, Cordelia. Very much indeed." As we talked late into the night, sharing stories, discovering lost connections, and tentatively sketching the outlines of a future, I felt Grandmother Annalise's presence in the room, her wisdom, her foresight, her unwavering certainty that truth, however long suppressed, would eventually prevail. She had orchestrated everything with masterful precision, ensuring that justice would be served without compelling me to be its sole executioner. In the end, Alistair's downfall came not from my actions, but from the stark revelation of his own character under pressure. He had spent decades ensuring I felt like an outsider in the Ashworth family, never once suspecting that he, by his own rigid criteria, was the true imposter all along. The irony was exquisite and perfectly, profoundly sufficient. As I looked towards a future that now included a father who genuinely wanted me in his life, a future unburdened by the need for an unprocurable approval, I realized that was the greatest inheritance of all.